You have noticed, perhaps without yet giving it a name, that something in you has grown quiet, not calm in the sentimental sense, not healed in the language of reassurance, but quiet in a deeper, stranger way. The noise that once surrounded you, other people's needs, their moods, their subtle accusations, their unspoken demands no longer enters you with the same violence. You still perceive it. You still understand it, but it does not pass through you as it once did. This is not numbness. It is not withdrawal born of fear. It is the beginning of what I would call a new psychic season. And seasons of the soul, like those of nature, are not chosen. They arrive when the inner time is ripe. For much of your life, your sensitivity functioned like an open wound disguised as a virtue. You felt what others did not feel. You anticipated what others ignored. You carried what others refused to hold. In analytical terms, your psyche learned very early that love was earned through attunement, safety through emotional vigilance, belonging through self-erasure. The empathic function became hypertrophied. It grew powerful, precise, almost prophetic, but it grew without the counterweight of boundaries. And so pain had direct access to you, not because you were weak, but because you were open in a world that rewards closure. What is happening now is not that you have become harder, it is that another function of the psyche has begun to assert itself. Silence has entered, not as absence, but as structure. You are discovering that there is an inner chamber into which not everything is permitted to enter. This is a decisive moment in individuation. Though few recognize it as such, many mistake it for depression, for disconnection, for loss of empathy. But in truth, it is the psyche correcting an imbalance that could no longer be sustained. In dreams, this phase often appears as distance. You may dream of watching events from behind glass, or standing on higher ground while others move below, or entering a quiet building while noise continues outside. These images are not about superiority, they are about containment. The unconscious is showing you that your energy is no longer meant to flow outward without limit. It is being gathered inward, not to disappear, but to be transformed. You must understand that the empath who has entered this silence has not escaped pain by avoiding life. Pain cannot touch you here because it no longer finds the same unconscious agreement. Pain requires participation. It requires that you absorb what does not belong to you, that you interpret another's chaos as your responsibility, that you confuse intensity with intimacy. Silence interrupts these unconscious contracts. It says nothing, and therefore it cannot be argued with, manipulated, or exploited. In earlier phases of your life, you spoke too quickly, not only with words, but with reactions, explanations, emotional availability. You answered before being asked. You softened before being attacked. You healed wounds that were not yours and called it love. The psyche tolerated this for as long as it could because it served survival, but survival is not the final aim of the soul. When the time comes for the self to emerge as a regulating center, such compulsive openness becomes a threat rather than a virtue. The silence you are entering now is not passive, it is observant. It watches without immediately responding. It allows things to reveal themselves fully before you decide what they mean. This alone changes the entire dynamic of your relationships. People who were accustomed to immediate access to your inner world feel unsettled. They sense the loss of control, though they may not name it that way. They may accuse you of being cold, distant, changed. In truth, you have changed. You have moved from unconscious participation to conscious presence. From a symbolic perspective, this is the descent of the empath into the cave, not as a victim, but as an initiate. In myth, the cave is the place where noise cannot follow, where the outer world loses its authority. It is where the hero confronts not the dragon of aggression, but the more subtle danger of dissolution. For the empath, the dragon has always been absorption, the loss of self in the emotional fields of others. Silence is the sword that cuts this bond, not violently, but decisively. You may notice that your compassion has not vanished, but it has cooled. It no longer rushes. It no longer rescues. It does not explain itself. This is a sign of maturation, not decline. True compassion does not require self-sacrifice. That belief belongs to the wounded child, not the individuated adult. The self does not bleed endlessly to prove its goodness. In this season, you begin to understand something unsettling. Many of the relationships that defined your identity were sustained by your overfunctioning, your listening, your forgiving. Your emotional labor filled gaps that others never learned to fill themselves. When you become silent, these structures collapse. This can produce guilt, grief, even a sense of betrayal, as if you have abandoned a role you were never consciously assigned. But the psyche does not measure truth by comfort. It measures it by alignment. Pain cannot touch you here, because pain no longer knows where you are. It searches for the old entrances, the reflexive apology, the instant empathy, the need to be understood. It knocks, but there is no answer. This does not mean you are unreachable. It means access must now be earned through reciprocity, respect, and reality. What cannot meet you there simply falls away. This silence is not permanent in the sense of stagnation. It is a winter, not a death. Something is gestating beneath it. But for now, the task is restraint, to not rush to define what you are becoming, to not translate this phase into language that makes others comfortable. The psyche needs quiet to reorganize itself. The self speaks softly at first. It does not compete with noise. You are learning to stay present without explaining, to feel without absorbing, to witness without intervening. This is a profound reorientation of psychic energy, and though it may feel lonely at times, it is not isolation. It is intimacy with your own center, something you were never allowed to develop before because your attention was always elsewhere. Remain here long enough, and you will notice that your silence is not empty. It is full of perception, clarity, and an emerging authority that does not announce itself. This is the season in which the empath stops being a field others move through and becomes a place unto themselves. There is often a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when you realize that your silence has weight, not the dramatic weight of confrontation or withdrawal, but a gravitational presence. When you do not immediately respond, the other is forced to encounter themselves. When you do not soften what you see, reality sharpens on its own. This is why silence feels dangerous to those who who once relied on your constant emotional availability. It removes the mirror that flattered their self-image and replaces it with one that reflects without distortion. In earlier stages of life, you believed that understanding others would protect you. If you could just see deeply enough, feel carefully enough, anticipate precisely enough, you might avoid abandonment, conflict, or cruelty. This belief was not foolish, it was adaptive. It arose in a psyche that learned very young that attunement was survival, but adaptation, when frozen into identity, becomes a prison. What once saved you begins to consume you. The empath then lives in a state of perpetual psychic exposure, unable to rest, unable to withdraw, unable to say no without guilt. The silence you now inhabit is the psyche's refusal to continue this bargain. It is not a decision made by the ego. If it were, it would feel forced, brittle, defensive. Instead, it feels inevitable. You do not argue less because you are trying to be wise. You argue less because the impulse has simply drained away. You do not explain yourself less as a strategy. You do so because something in you no longer recognizes the old urgency. This is how genuine transformation occurs, not through effort, but through exhaustion of what no longer serves life. From a Jungian perspective, this is the withdrawal of libido from outdated complexes. The empathic complex, once overcharged, begins to lose its dominance. Energy returns to the self, the organizing center of the psyche that is not identical with the ego. The self does not speak in moral language. It does not say you are good or bad for becoming quieter. It simply reclaims what was scattered. This phase is often accompanied by a strange neutrality. You still care, but you are no longer consumed. You still see suffering, but you do not dissolve into it. This neutrality can feel unsettling because it contradicts the identity you have lived inside for so long. You may ask yourself whether you are becoming indifferent, whether you are losing something essential, but indifference is deadness. What you are experiencing is containment. A vessel has finally formed around your sensitivity. Symbols of this often emerge spontaneously in imagination and dream. You may envision walls, cloaks, forests, night skies, deep water. These are not symbols of escape. They are symbols of depth and boundary. The forest, for example, is not empty. It is alive, complex, ordered in a way the conscious mind cannot easily control. To enter, it is to leave the noise of the village without abandoning life itself. Silence, in this sense, is not absence of connection but a different mode of it. It is here that many empaths confront the shadow, not the shadow of cruelty or aggression, which they have long disowned, but the shadow of refusal, the capacity to say no without justification, the capacity to let others feel disappointed, the capacity to be misunderstood and remain intact. These qualities were once projected onto figures you feared or judged as selfish, cold, or unkind. Now they return as necessary components of psychic wholeness. This return can feel like betrayal of your former self. You may grieve the version of you who was endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly patient. That self carried real love, real devotion, but it also carried unconscious self-erasure. To mourn, it is not to regress. It is to honor the cost it paid so that something more complete could emerge. Notice how pain behaves differently now. Before, pain entered through identification. Someone's anger felt like your failure. Someone's sadness felt like your obligation. Someone's confusion felt like your responsibility. Pain was intimate because you had no membrane. Now, pain approaches and finds surface instead of entry. You recognize it, name it, and let it pass without absorbing it. This is not avoidance, it is discernment. You are beginning to live from a deeper authority, one that does not argue for its right to exist. This authority does not come from confidence in the usual sense. It comes from alignment. When you no longer act against yourself, you no longer need to convince others of your worth. Silence carries this alignment effortlessly. It says, without words, I am here, and I am not for consumption. Died. Others will test this. Some will push harder, speak louder, provoke more intensely, hoping to awaken the old responsiveness. This is not always malicious. Often it is unconscious panic. They sense that a familiar source of regulation has gone quiet, but it is not your task to soothe this panic. Each psyche must now face its own imbalance. In mythic terms, this is the empath, stepping out of the role of the wounded healer and into the role of the quiet witness. The wounded healer heals because they bleed. The witness heals by seeing. One expends energy endlessly, the other preserves it. Both have their place, but they do not belong to the same season of life. You may find that words themselves feel heavier now. You choose them more carefully, or not at all. Where you once filled silence with reassurance, you now allow it to stand. This can feel awkward, even cruel, to those accustomed to constant emotional feedback. But silence, when grounded, is not neglect. It is an invitation to maturity. Remain attentive to this phase. Do not rush to turn it into an identity or a doctrine. Silence is a threshold, not a destination. It is preparing you for a form of engagement that is no longer reactive, no longer sacrificial, no longer driven by unconscious need. Something in you is learning how to relate without losing itself, and this learning requires time, solitude, and patience. The psyche is reorganizing itself around a new center. If you listen closely, not outwardly, but inwardly, you may sense a quiet confidence forming, one that does not seek recognition. This is the ground from which your next way of being will grow. There comes a moment in this silence when you realize that it is no longer simply a refuge. It has become a lens. Through it, you begin to see patterns that were once obscured by your own emotional participation. When you are no longer entangled in the immediate need to soothe, explain, or repair, perception sharpens. You notice not only what people say, but when they say it, why they say it, and what they avoid saying altogether. This is not suspicion. It is clarity born of distance. For the empath, this clarity can feel almost unsettling because it reveals how much of life is driven by unconscious exchange. You see how often closeness was maintained not through mutual presence, but through unspoken contracts. You feel, I withdraw, you forgive, I repeat, you carry, I avoid. These contracts rarely survive silence. When one party stops performing their role, The pattern exposes itself. This exposure is painful for some, liberating for others, and disorienting for nearly everyone involved. In analytical psychology, we would say that projection begins to withdraw when you were highly reactive. Others could project their needs, fears, and unmet longings into your responsiveness. You became the container for what they could not face. Silence interrupts this process. Without immediate emotional reflection, the projection falls back onto its owner. This is often experienced by them as discomfort, irritation, or loss. But in truth, it is a necessary step toward their own individuation. Whether they take that step is no longer within your control. You may find that your own inner life becomes richer during this time, though quieter on the surface. Images, memories, and questions emerge that have little to do with others. You may feel drawn to solitary walks, to symbolic material, to reflection without a clear goal. This is the psyche turning inward, not out of withdrawal, but out of necessity. Energy that was once dispersed is now available for integration. Here, the archetype of the hermit often becomes active. The hermit is not antisocial, they are devoted to essence. They step back from the collective noise in order to hear the deeper rhythms of the soul. In many traditions, the hermit appears at the threshold between one life structure and another. They do not yet know what comes next, but they know that the old way of living is no longer possible. This phase often brings a re-evaluation of what you once called love. You begin to see the difference between intimacy and fusion, between care and self-abandonment. Love that requires you to disappear is no longer recognizable as love. Compassion that demands your silence about your own needs reveals itself as imbalance. These realizations do not arrive with anger, they arrive with a quiet sadness, followed by resolve. Pain, in this season, loses its dramatic quality. It no longer announces itself with urgency. When it arises, it is more contained, more informative. It tells you where something is misaligned rather than demanding immediate action. This shift alone changes your relationship to suffering. You stop asking how to eliminate it and start asking what it is showing you. This is a subtle but profound transformation. You may also encounter a kind of loneliness that is unfamiliar, not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of differentiation. When you no longer merge easily, you no longer feel constantly accompanied. This can be misinterpreted as loss, but differentiation is the price of becoming a self. Without it, there is only belonging through disappearance. The shadow continues its work here. You may notice impulses to withdraw completely, to sever ties abruptly, to retreat into isolation as a defense. This is the shadow form of silence. True silence is open, not closed, receptive, not avoidant. The task is not to build walls of contempt, but to maintain boundaries of clarity. This distinction is crucial. One hardens the psyche, the other strengthens it. In dreams, this distinction may appear as doors rather than walls. Doors can be closed or opened intentionally. Walls simply block. The psyche is teaching you choice. Where once there was compulsion to engage, there is now the possibility of discernment. You decide when to speak, when to listen, when to step forward, when to remain still. You may also sense an emerging relationship to authority. both inner and outer, external authority opinions, expectations, moral demands begins to lose its absolute power over you, not because you rebel, but because you consult something deeper before complying. Inner authority, however, is still fragile at this stage. It speaks quietly and can be drowned out if you rush back into noise. This is why the silence must be protected. This protection may require disappointments. You may decline invitations without elaborate reasons. You may leave conversations unfinished. You may allow misunderstandings to exist rather than rushing to correct them. These actions can feel cruel to the old empathic identity, but they are acts of fidelity to the emerging self. Every individuation process requires such fidelity. Notice, too, how your body responds. Often there is less tension, less anticipatory anxiety. The nervous system, long accustomed to hypervigilance, begins to downshift. Silence is not only psychological, it is physiological. The body recognizes when it is no longer required to brace itself constantly for emotional impact. You are not disappearing, you are consolidating. What feels like absence on the surface is actually coherence forming beneath it. The psyche is learning how to hold itself together without constant external feedback. This is not a small accomplishment. It is the groundwork for a new way of relating that does not cost you your center. Stay with this phase without trying to explain it to yourself too quickly. Explanation is a form of control, and this transformation cannot be controlled. It unfolds according to its own inner logic. Your task is simply to remain attentive, honest, and patient. The silence will not last forever in this form, but what it builds within you will remain. When you eventually speak again from this place, your words will carry a different weight. They will no longer ask to be understood, they will simply be true. Eventually, the silence begins to change its texture. It is no longer only a space of withdrawal and observation. It becomes a ground from which movement can occur without urgency. You may notice that when you do speak now, your words do not scatter. They land, they do not seek approval or relief. They are fewer, but they are aligned. This is how you know that the silence has done its work. It has not emptied you, it has concentrated you. At this stage, the empath often realizes something quietly revolutionary. Strength does not announce itself through force or explanation. It is felt through consistency. When you no longer oscillate between overgiving and collapse, between closeness and resentment, your presence stabilizes. Others sense this even if they cannot articulate it. They feel less able to pull you into their emotional weather. Some will step closer with respect, others will drift away. Neither movement requires your intervention. From the standpoint of the psyche, this is the integration of sensitivity with sovereignty. Sensitivity alone dissolves, sovereignty alone isolates. Together, they form a self that can remain permeable without being penetrated. This is rare, not because it is exceptional, but because it demands that one survive the loneliness of differentiation without retreating into hardness. In symbolic language, you have crossed from the open plain into the walled city, not a city of defense, but of order. The walls are not there to exclude life, but to define it. Inside, there is rhythm, hierarchy, meaning. Outside, there is noise, urgency, and endless demand. You can move between the two now, but you are no longer homeless within yourself. Pain, in this phase, becomes instructive rather than invasive. When it appears, it does not flood you. It signals you listen, adjust, and continue. This is what it means when one says that pain cannot touch you here. It does not mean that suffering has vanished from your life. It means that suffering no longer claims ownership of your identity. It passes through awareness without taking residence. You may reflect on your earlier life and see it with new eyes, not with contempt, not even with regret, but with comprehension. You understand why you were as you were. You understand the child who learned to read rooms before reading books, who learned to feel others before feeling themselves. This understanding does not pull you backward, it releases you forward. Compassion, when turned inward, becomes freedom. Relationships that remain now do so on different terms. They are slower, less dramatic, more real. They tolerate silence. They survive disagreement. They do not require you to perform your goodness. In them, you are not indispensable. And this is precisely why they are nourishing. They do not feed on your depletion. They meet you where you stand. There may still be moments when the old reflex stirs the urge to explain, to rescue, to smooth over discomfort. These moments are not failures. They are echoes. You notice them, and they pass. The difference now is that you are no longer possessed by them. Awareness has created space, and in that space, choice lives. The archetype that quietly emerges here is not the healer, not the martyr, not the sage in the conventional sense, but the rooted one, the tree that stands without reaching compulsively for every passerby. Its shade is available, but it does not chase. Its fruit ripens in its own time. Those who come do so because they are ready, not because the tree bends itself toward them. This rootedness is not dramatic. It will not be celebrated by the culture that thrives on excess emotion and constant disclosure, but it will be felt by those who encounter you. They will sense that you are not easily moved off your center, and this will either calm them or unsettle them. Both responses are honest. Do not be surprised if creativity, insight, or quiet joy begins to surface here. When energy is no longer spent on constant emotional management, it seeks expression. This expression does not need an audience. It is enough that it exists. The psyche delights in this kind of autonomy. You have entered a season where your presence is no longer porous. It is receptive, but it is whole. Silence has taught you that you are not obligated to be accessible to everything that calls itself need. You have learned that withdrawal can be an act of fidelity, not rejection. And you have discovered that when you stop scattering yourself, something essential gathers. This is not an ending, it is a threshold crossed so quietly that others may not notice it at all. But you will notice, you will feel it in the way you stand, the way you listen, the way you no longer rush to fill space. Pain will still exist in the world, but it will meet you differently now. It will recognize that you are no longer an open wound, but a living boundary. And from this place, when you do choose to engage, to speak, to care, it will no longer cost you your soul,